Alright, hello everyone. Welcome back for another round of APUSH. So today we're looking at competition and conflict in the Atlantic world. So looking at how these different empires and civilizations are connected using the Atlantic Ocean as a medium. So as this thing that connects rather than divides. It's a different way of looking at history, and it's actually pretty fascinating. So let's jump right into it. Okay, so the first thing we need to talk about is this idea of an Atlantic economy and all the different participants and ideas that are involved in there. Now, this is actually a whole study of history, and it is known as Atlantic history, unsurprisingly. So I took a class on this in college, and it really interested me because it looks at history from a different lens. Oftentimes we look at history from the lens of what's going on in the United States. American history, what's going on in Europe, European history, what's going on in Britain, British history. All these different things focus on land as kind of the focus of what you're studying. Atlantic history says, let's not look so much as what's going on in one region, but how does an ocean connect these different regions. You can do a similar sort of study with the Mediterranean Ocean in studying how it connected Europe, Africa, and Asia. So there's a couple, you don't really need to know these, but just some fun terms to go along with it. So cisatlantic history is when you just focus on one region, so that means one side. Transatlantic history means when you focus on comparing histories in different regions, and circumatlantic history is when you look at the connections and interactions throughout all these different components of the Atlantic world. Now, the main thing that if we were to focus on that circumatlantic point of view would be the South Atlantic system. You can call it triangle trade, even the Golden Triangle. It all means the same thing. It's talking about how trade operated within the Atlantic and how the Atlantic fueled the development of the economy between the Americas, Africa, and Europe. Alright, so you've got a map there as the middle image that has actually labeled what are the different things going to different places. That's a very good map to know and a good process to know. Here it is in text, kind of condensed. So, one leg of it, and this one was called the Middle Passage, was slaves going from Africa to the Caribbean region, the British West Indies. Okay, from there up to the British colonies would go sugar that was grown in the Caribbean up to New England. Now, in New England, they would process that sugar because it lasts longer. Oops, it's already all there. My bad. Into rum to take to Europe, so it would transport, and of course they're going to want alcohol as well. And once these raw materials that come from the Americas and can't really be found in Europe are taken to Europe, they're consumed, and then those ships are now going back down to Africa, still with manufactured goods that are being loaded up in Europe to sell and trade for slaves down in Africa, and then they pick up more slaves and go back to America. It's this triangle, back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, and ultimately here's what it does. The impact is that England gains tremendous wealth because it was such an efficient system in a way that no part of the trip was wasted. You didn't have an empty ship going anywhere, and it kind of fueled itself. All right, so the economy in the North, we could define it as urban, coastal, and focused on trade. Remember, we're going to get to that term mercantilism in just a little bit, but it was this idea that the colonies should be serving only the British Empire. Here's what the northern area, so pretty much New England, was doing with their industries. So, converting molasses, a byproduct of the sugar down from the Caribbean, into rum, and also the fishing industry up in New England when you're getting up into what is Canada today off the coast. There's also a shipbuilding industry. Now, there are ample supplies of wood there. Lots of Europe had been deforested because they'd been already using that wood to build ships and houses and all those things. The Americas were less populated, so they used the wood there to make ships instead, which could then work within that Atlantic economy. Now, what happens because of this focus on trade is the rise of merchant elites. Merchant elites are the people who are providing the money, the investment, and all these various enterprises within the Atlantic economy. And think of people like shipbuilders. they're going to be an artisan middle class, people who are actually crafting these raw materials into things that could then be sold within the British Empire. All right, next up is focusing a little bit on what was going on with Native American tribes. This is kind of something we continually come back to, and it's really never good news. So remember, back in the Columbian Exchange, 90% of the Native American population had died, right? And they would have died just from that lack of immunities, even if the European colonists had come with the message of peace and prosperity. Two of the major diseases, two of the most deadly, were measles and smallpox. So today there are vaccines for both of those, so smallpox is gone. Measles is mostly gone, but it's actually back in the news because people are choosing for the kids not to get the measles vaccine, which results in people getting it. Okay, it can be a deadly disease if it's not treated soon or inoculated through a vaccine. So those type of things didn't exist back then. So what happened with Europeans is many would get it, many would die, but those who survived now had sort of the genetic immunities, so that when they had children, those children would also have those immunities to make them better apt to repelling the smallpox or measles viruses. Right, so this similar trend continues of Native Americans dying from these diseases for which they had no immunities, continues into the 18th century as more and more Europeans come to the Americas. So just when the natives thought that they'd got over this hill of, okay, we got through this disease, most of them died off, then more immigrants would come and potentially bring other diseases that had not been introduced to the Americas before. Okay, now what did some of these tribes do? Now some of them chose to adapt and sought to trade with the colonists. Now here's what happened though. If those services were valued by the colonists, then the colonists would not go into conflict. Think if we rewind a little bit to French trade, the French said, well, the Indians could be a valuable trading partner, so they had a good relationship. If those services weren't valued by the colonists, if the colonists instead wanted to take their land, there would be conflict instead. And actually what we see for most of British America was conflict rather than cooperation. Okay, an example of an adaptation where tribes adapted rather than opposed the British colonies were the Catawba. I'm not sure if that's precisely how to say it, so apologies, in South Carolina. Now what they did is they said, well, look at these new techniques of artisan crafts that are coming from Europe, and they actually used those with the Catawba in their basket weaving. They said, well, the way the Europeans doing it are actually a little bit more efficient and maybe tighter in how it creates the basket. Let's preserve our traditions of basket weaving, but also incorporate these new strategies that are going to help us be a trading partner with the colonists rather than necessarily their enemy from right off the bat. Okay, other tribes in this sort of realm of conflict with the colonists fell apart through their alliances or lack of them. So, good example are the Huron. So today we think of Lake Huron. That's named after a tribe that used to be up in the Great Lakes. So they made alliances with the French, but the Iroquois, which are going to be a confederacy, so a large group of tribes that we're going to keep talking about, they allied to the Dutch, and there was a lot of sort of conflict within the Native American tribes as well. Think of this. As the colonists were pushing some natives off their land, the natives were then migrating into regions that were occupied by other natives. So not only was there conflict between colonists and natives, but native-on-native violence as well, fueled by European introduction into the Americas. All right, so here we're talking about more trade with the sorry, I didn't move mine forward. So, actually it's the same one, we just have a whole lot of information. Okay, interactions between European rivals and American Indian populations, accommodation and conflict. Oh, okay, so what we're focusing on here is what's going on with the natives because the Europeans are so involved. So we're looking kind of at these European conflicts within the colonies, kind of as like proxy wars. Sorry about my confusion there for a second. So actually what I do is I have yours on another screen here, mine here, and I got kind of confused. My bad, but here we go. So oftentimes Native American tribes made different and altering alliances with European powers for what suited their needs at the time, and that makes complete sense. One of the biggest political, native political powers at the time was the Iroquois Confederacy, and actually if you look at the New York map there, you can see that's the Iroquois Confederacy divided up into different tribes that were part of this kind of, almost in the same way as our states are part of the country, the United States as a whole. These various parts and various tribes came together to create the Iroquois Confederacy. All right, so they were looking for territorial sovereignty. So British colonists often on poor terms with them, and unfortunately for the European powers, the colonists were often doing things that undermined the goals of the European powers. So it was really more in the interest of the European powers to have good relations with the natives because they could be trading partners like we saw with the French. But because the colonists were often pretty land hungry and looking to expand, and the British government and other colonial governments, I should say European governments, were not looking for that expansion, it's going to cause some conflict with the natives and the colonists, and then in turn with the colonists and the European powers back home. So there's actually a lot of small wars that are fought between these various colonial powers, so the French, the Dutch, the British, and the Spanish, and it's called the Second 100 Years' War. So the first 100 Years' War was between between England and France all the way back in the earlier... I'm so bad with dates, guys, I'm sorry, but I know Joan of Arc was involved here. This one is more representing a series of smaller wars that ultimately ends with Napoleon and the Congress of Vienna. So hopefully you remember that from AP Euro. Very brief overview of what some of these wars were. King William's War, Queen Anne's War, King George's War, and the French and Indian War. Now notice they have other names in parentheses there. Those other names are what Europe called the war, but because these were wars of empire, these were wars being fought between empires, they were fought both in Europe and in the Americas as well. And what happened in the Americas is Americans gave names to these wars named after the monarchs or countries involved because they didn't see the wars as theirs to fight. So, War of the League of Augsburg, what'd they say? Oh, who was the king at the time? King William. It's his war, not our problem. War of Spanish Succession, the queen was Anne at the time. It's her war. Now, we actually see a shift there with the French and Indian War, but we're going to talk about that a lot more at the beginning of period 3. Just realize that these empires in red over there on the left are continuing to have conflict over their empires, which have expanded into Europe, causing competition and conflict, which again is the title of this total slideshow. All right, so goals and interests of the European leaders and colonists diverged at times. Okay, so this is getting to the idea that what the colonists want wasn't always what the European powers wanted. And one of the guiding principles behind this that caused the conflict is the idea of mercantilism. Now, I've talked about this several times in other slideshows. It was the economic system of American empires. Here's a formal definition. It's when colonies benefit from exclusive trade with the mother country because that mother country has the military strength to support them. In turn, the mother country benefits because colonies are only allowed to trade with the mother country. Okay, so it's kind of a give and take. Economic benefits versus political benefits. So, remember, we're shifting to capitalism in this time period, but mercantilism doesn't really fit in with capitalism because capitalism says there should be no regulation of the economy. Mercantilism says there is regulation of the economy because you can only trade with your mother country. So, a term that we've studied before, which is back again to haunt us, salutary neglect. The colonists had gotten used to doing their own thing. They'd gotten used to a lack of regulation, and mercantilism was still being economically viable for Britain, so they weren't challenging salutary neglect. But there were various times throughout the years when it was challenged by the colonists, and when Britain came in and tried to impose more power. Here's an example. Major one you need to know are the Navigation Acts. So you're actually going to read one of these in your quiz after the presentation. But what they represented as a whole was increased direct involvement and enforced trade laws. So that meant that it wasn't just, this general rule or guideline that you need to be trading with British ships only. It was now going to actually be enforced. So the colonists could in turn not trade with other countries, and they resented this. Okay, they resented it because they'd gotten used to doing their own thing with salutary neglect, and now this kind of force of control upon them embittered them. So what did they do? They did just what they used to do. They smuggled a lot. Okay, now the thing was they were actually breaking a formal law instead of just not following the rules. Okay, they had become accustomed to autonomy, which meant that they were not dealing well with this new regulation. This is really kind of foreshadowing for the American Revolution. You study the American Revolution at some other point in your history as a student, and you know that those taxes imposed upon the colonists after the French and Indian War, those were several of the reasons why America actually rebelled and then eventually declared its independence. It did not like this force of control when it felt it could manage things on its own. Now, something interesting about one of the Navigation Acts, you're going to look at the first Navigation Act, and it actually, when you look at the text of it, it was not very well enforced. And in fact, the only consequence that came from it is that you lost all the goods that you were trying to smuggle. So you didn't go to jail, you didn't go to court or anything. Your items just got seized and you lived to smuggle another day. Okay? So basically the Navigation Acts didn't work out too well because salutary neglect had already set the mood for being opposed to those sorts of regulations. All right, so our next two slides are about military conflicts between the natives and with the European colonists. So this one's focusing on British conflicts specifically. Wars were directly fought. I'll give you a few of them. I've already told you a bit about how the natives sometimes allied with the Europeans and sometimes were adversaries to them with different powers within the same time period. So the natives changed their positions based on what fit them rather than what fit the European needs. So as the British sought more lasting settlements and started to push further west, there were a lot more conflicts, and here's a good overview. Now, one of the earlier ones in 1622 was the Indian War with the Powhatan tribe. So Powhatan was the name of the tribe and also the name of the chief, and this is where we get kind of that myth of Pocahontas. So, saving John Smith from being captured and killed by her father, much like the Disney movie tries to portray that. There's a lot of myth in there, and John Smith was kind of like, basically our source is him telling the story about himself. And other sources say he claimed the same thing happened when he was like sailing around in the Mediterranean. So we're on shaky grounds for reliability, but all the same, there was conflict between the Jamestown settlers and the local natives, and it was actually because of conflicts like this that Virginia became a royal colony rather than a charter colony. Charter colony meant joint stock company, right? That meant that they were there for an economic profit, not really to settle down. So that meant that the company was in charge of the colony. Royal colony means the British government is in charge of the colony instead. And because it seemed like these charter colonies could not control Indian conflicts on their own, the British government stepped in to do it on their own. Okay, there were conflicts with Indians up in New England as well. So the Puritan-Pequot War. So Pequots were one of the major tribe groups up there. And the Puritans, what they did is they kind of tried to divide and conquer in a way. So ally with some tribes to defeat the more powerful Pequots. And what happened is because the Puritans allied with certain tribes, convinced them to be on their side, they divided the natives to defeat the stronger power. So, if you've heard the military strategy like divide and conquer, it's basically what they were doing. Okay? And so, because there was a lack of cohesive alliances between the natives, they were never able to really properly fight off the Puritans and the growth up in New England. Okay, now, this next conflict is one you've got to know. You've got to know the year it happened, the name, and what occurred, because if you look to the left, it is in red. It's mentioned by name, and what that really means is on the AP test, they can just ask you about it. They expect you to know what it is, when it happened. They don't have to give you any context, and they just expect you to know it. So, what happened here is we're dealing with continued conflict in New England. So the chief of this tribe, his name was Metacom. The English colonists called him King Philip. So what the colonists would often do is they would give the natives some sort of anglicized name to kind of what essentially it did is it limited the cultural autonomy of the native groups themselves. So this was a resurgence of violence after there'd been relative peace for 40 years. Now the reason there had been relative peace is because a lot of the natives had just moved further west away from the Puritans. But as New England grew and as all these, people moved there and the population expanded, they started to expand further into native territory, and that conflict came again. So what happened? King Philip or Metacom was killed, and also 40% of the natives. Think of that. 4 in 10 were killed. And effectively, why this is important is it ends active native resistance. Most of the tribes now just have the policy that when the colonist starts to come into their land, they say, we're getting out of here because we don't want to lose so much of our population and our people again. Natives really depended on cooperation and kind of communal living in order to make their societies work. And if you're losing 40% of your population, your society isn't working anymore. So they just moved forward, further west, I should say, to get away from the colonists, to get away from the English, because they could see how it was going. All right, so know that one well. All right, our last slide. It's one of the last times we're going to look directly at the Spanish Empire. I think there's one more time after this. At the end of period 3, I think, is when we look at it. Okay, so the big term in red on the left is the Pueblo Revolt, and it kind of goes in line with the previous slide of dealing with direct conflict with the natives, but this time from the Spanish perspective. So Pueblo Revolt, 1680, another thing you need to know by name. You need to know the year and what it was. Remember, the Spanish had been using the encomienda system and the casta system in order to make their empire work, to assert control. But what happened is they had a pretty large empire. It was even divided up into different viceroyalties, and it was being profitable for them, but a lot of the natives, especially those centered further away from where the Spanish cities and capitals were, they started to say, hey, why do we have to follow these rules? So because the encomienda system came in and shifted views on land and the social structure, I think I already said this before in another presentation dealing with Catholicism. Yeah. So Pueblo Revolt. It happened in modern-day New Mexico, and you can see the map there to show where the Pueblo people were living. Lots in Arizona and New Mexico of today. So Pueblo people rose up against the Spanish rule there because Spanish rule was not lax, but it didn't have much of a presence. So what happened within this uprising? 300 Spaniards were killed, and the rest fled. They said, we haven't had a lot of direct conflict because we've tried to accommodate more, but apparently not enough. So it reveals the difficulties of administering such an extensive empire, going all the way up into the southern modern-day United States, all throughout modern-day Mexico, into Central America, into South America. It was a big thing to deal with. So what happened because of the Pueblo Revolt, and this really should show you the trend of how Spain approached its empires, is when it ran into these difficulties, it tried to give greater autonomy and less hegemony to the people who were angry. So they said, okay, Pueblo people, we'll accommodate your traditions. We're going to stop trying to control you as much. It shows Spain was willing to adapt to the native traditions while still controlling them. Remember, it's this careful balance between how do we say we're the ones in charge, but also not making those that you're subjugating feel so subjugated that they rise up and try to, kill you and defeat you. Spain kind of worked that out better for themselves. The British colonists do not. And when we get up to the French and Indian War, up to the Revolutionary War, we're going to see that because the British colonists have a different mentality, they're not willing to accommodate any of these things that Spain was willing to accommodate within their own colonies. All right, thanks for watching. As always, there are your next steps. Follow them, do them, and I will see you later.